Hello everybody, and in this video I'm going to show you a lot of opening positions in the Slav defence. This has been played at pretty much all levels for many years now. It's considered a very strong, solid opening for black, and it usually starts with d4, d5. And the most common move for white is c4. And the beginning of the Slav is c6. So let's have a look at this position here. What we can see is that rather than play e6, black has chosen to play c6, which allows the light squared bishop to come out if they choose to. On the downside, though, it can limit the knight on b8, its activity. And I'm not really going to go into the exchange Slav, which is just c takes and c takes, as this is completely level and it just basically goes back into a Queen's Gambit decline type position. So one very common move white can play is knight f3. This will mostly transpose to other positions in the Slav. And black has several responses. One is e6, trying to create an early pawn triangle, but of course this does seal in the the light squared bishop now. So I don't really like this move for black, but it is very a consolidating move. So it isn't weakening, but it does somewhat limit piece play. E3 can be played. Again, I might play bishop f4, but e3 is certainly seen a lot in the Slav, with the idea of the bishop perhaps going to d2 or fianchettoing. Knight f6. Knight c3, very common. Knight bd7. Get the pieces out, bishop d3. And once the bishop on f1 has moved, black often then takes on c4 to make the white bishop look a bit silly and move twice. Then black needs to get out their light squared bishop. So a very common idea is to be able to play c5 and give yourself more of a space with this pawn break. So the idea would be to fianchetto with the light squared bishop, and then to play c5, giving the bishop a lot of scope on the long diagonal. And then both sides will castle, and will then get a fairly complex middle game. But here I don't really see any problem for black. The idea might be to play a6 to safeguard b5, then either rook c8 or c5 immediately. And from there it will be a middle game battle. White's plan is probably to either play a4, trying to challenge black's setup on the queen side. Sometimes playing e4, releasing the c1 bishop is an idea, and placing the two rooks on the d and c files to try and harass the black queen. So this is a very even position, but a bit imbalanced. So there's a lot of potential for a win or a loss in this position. It's not a stone cold draw, but black is doing fine here. Okay, another line of the Slav is, instead of playing e6, perhaps just delay it with knight f6 immediately. This is my preference, because the knight always goes to f6, whereas you may want to put the bishop outside the pawn chain or not, depending on what white does. So this goes back to a previous video I did on playing the obvious move, the move that's always played, before the optional moves, in order to change and adapt your plans better. So white can then play knight c3, bishop f5. So let's have a look at the bishops being outside the pawn chains. White can play bishop f4 or bishop to g5, e6 now, and e3. So it's similar to the previous position, except the bishops are out of the pawn chains. And what would often happen there is that the queens would be developed here with, after knight bd7, just to get the knight out, White could play queen b3. And the idea is that because the bishop has left c8, the b7 pawn is now slightly vulnerable. And if Black moves the pawn, then the c6 pawn could become a target with a move like rook c1. So Black will often play queen b6. And now we can get to a rather interesting theme in the Slav. Often one side is going to trade queens and there'll be an imbalance on the queen side. So a very popular move in this position is for White to restrict the dark squared bishop, increase the pawn chain, and force Black to make a decision. On the downside, it does release tension in the center. So c5, and now Black can't really afford to not trade queens, because if queen a5, then I'm pretty sure that queen takes b7 is going to be quite bad for Black. So queen takes queen, a takes. Now this is the position which is quite hard to judge. White has the open a file to work on, yet has backward pawns on b2 and b3. They're doubled, they're not very good. So there's some dynamic potential for White, whereas Black has the more solid pawn structure. Overall, I would say White is slightly better due to also having the advantage in space. So after a6, just to protect the pawns, bishop e2, bishop e7, castle, b4 first actually, that's probably a better move. Castles, castles. What White may try and do at some future point is to try and push b5, maybe by pinning the pawn on a6, by first doubling rooks on the a file. Often this won't be the case though, but one plan White could have is to use these pawns on the queen side to restrict Black's activity, and then to try and increase the pressure incrementally on one wing of the board. Most commonly the queen side, but perhaps White could switch to a kingside attack, thinking that they've locked down the queen side, so they may as well fight on the king side. Black is going to try and wait this out, play a long waiting game, and trade down to the end game, where the pawn structure will be advantageous for Black. Also, knights here are going to be much better than bishops. So if one side can trade off so it's got a majority of knights, then they'll generally be doing better. So going back, one more quite critical line of the Slav is if Black instead takes on c4. So this is quite like the Queen's Gambit accepted, except that the moves c6 and knight f3 have been inserted, which does actually have consequences. After e3, aiming to win the pawn back, Black can trade down to a very level position after bishop e6, a4, preventing b5, protecting the pawns, knight f6, and knight a3, which is often seen, even in the Queen's Gambit, accepted. c5. So already Black is trying to do the pawn break in order to equalize on space, but is giving up the pawn on c4. So after white does take on c4 and black exchanges, takes, and white would have an isolated pawn if e3 takes on d4. So instead queen takes is more common. But now black can continue development with knight c6. And if the queen moves away, then maybe e6 is good for black here. But queen takes and rook takes have been seen quite a lot in tournament play. And we already reach a very interesting middle game. But in my opinion, black has already equalized. The knights for white are slightly more aggressive than black's knights. They're controlling more of the enemy territory. Then again, white's bishop is a little difficult to get to a good square, but black's bishop is controlling a lot of dark squares. Particularly the b4 square is going to be very important. White has now got a backward b pawn, and black does not want that pawn to become level with its fellow on a4. So the b4 square is going to be controlled by black for the foreseeable future. And it's quite hard to know what to do with the kings. Obviously don't castle queenside, as there's no real protection for the king. But I would say that white should play a move like king e2 and then bishop d2 and rook h to d1, as there may be a lot more trades quite soon, and then we'll be reaching a late middle game or early end game where the kings could be very useful and could play quite a significant role in the battle in the end game. They won't be very useful hiding out in the corners. So this position certainly has negatives and positives for both sides. I'd say black is equal, but maybe others would disagree. Again, but this is why the Slav is seen as being very solid for black. Even when white has certain advantages, black has a lot of long-term advantages, such as pawn structure and piece placement a lot of the time. So I don't play the Slav actually as white, and as black it doesn't suit my temperament. What I do is first move I play c4, and if black plays d5 I take. So if black wants a Slav, they'll play c6. And if you play d4, then you're going to get a Slav with d5. So we're then going to reach the positions earlier that have been outlined. But the move I play to create a lot of tactics and dynamic possibilities is the move e4, which goes into the Kara-Khan. This is a pseudo-Panov-Botvinnik. So if you're black in this position and white has done this rather unexpected move, I don't think many people do this actually, it might just be me for all I know. You have two options. One is the positional move, e5, and then after knight f3, probably the best option is d6. And here I think that if white wants to play this really positionally, they could play knight c3, and black may even choose to play c5, and then both sides will have huge holes on d4 and d5. So the move I play as white is d4, and now we're going to reach a position similar to the Maroczy bind type positions in the Sicilian, except that instead of the c pawn missing for black, it will be the e pawn. It will create some very unusual positions which aren't in many opening books. So it also allows both sides to play creatively and not just rattle off a bunch of moves that they've got from an opening, from studying openings. So this position is very good in terms of strategic play. So if you don't like lots of tactics, play e5. But the main line, and the move a lot of people do, is d5. And I love this for white, actually. I play takes, c takes, and now we have the pseudo Panov-Botvinnik. I won't go into this much more because this video is on the Slav, but just to show certain different positions that can arise from a move order. Black often plays knight f6, and then we get the true pseudo Panov-Botvinnik. Other times, queen takes d5 has been seen, and then we get a rather unusual type of Scandinavian position. So there are a lot of hidden potential transpositions in the Slav defense. Anyway, I hope you like this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.